Julian Vance watched the rain lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 40th floor office. Each drop that struck the reinforced glass was a tiny, insignificant impact, yet together they created a relentless drumming that echoed the frantic pulse in his own temples. The city below was a blur of neon and hurried headlights, a world away from the sterile silence of his corner of the sky. He loosened the knot of his silk tie, the fabric a soft gray that matched the storm clouds, and, he suspected, the color of his soul. On his mahogany desk, a single tablet glowed with the stark figures of a hostile takeover bid. The numbers were aggressive, the strategy ruthless. His board expected him to be more so. They expected him to be the predator he had always been. A chime from his private line cut through the quiet. It was Marcus, his second in command, his voice a low hiss of ambition. They're moving on the subsidiary in Singapore. We need to cut it loose, strip the assets. There will be collateral damage. Pensions, Julian's jaw tightened. It was the logical move, the profitable move. It was also the move that would leave 2,000 people with nothing. He ended the call without a word, the tablet's cold light illuminating the exhaustion etched on his face. He was a king in a glass castle, surrounded by wealth but utterly alone. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe the filtered, temperature-controlled air. He needed to get out. He needed a moment where the only thing demanding his attention was the simple act of moving from one place to another. The ride down in the private elevator was a silent descent from his throne. In the lobby, polished marble reflected a distorted, elongated version of himself, a man he barely recognized. His driver, a stoic man named Arthur who had been with him for a decade, held the door to the limousine open. The interior was a cocoon of black leather and hushed quiet, a mobile version of his office. As the car pulled into the rain-choked streets of downtown, the city's chaos felt both immediate and distant. Traffic was at a standstill, a symphony of angry horns and splashing tires. Julian stared out the tinted window, his mind still churning through asset liquidation and pension funds. He felt nothing for the numbers or the faceless people they represented. He was supposed to feel nothing. That was the secret to his success. Then he saw them. At a bus stop, huddled under a flimsy, inadequate awning, stood a woman and a little girl. The woman's coat was thin, and she held it open, trying to shield the child from the driving wind and rain. The child, no older than 6 or 7, buried her face in her mother's side. They were getting soaked, yet there was a stillness about the woman, a quiet dignity in the way she stood against the storm that cut through Julian's cynical haze. He did not know why he did it. It was an impulse, a glitch in the cold programming of his day. He leaned forward. "Arthur," he said, his voice raspy, "pull over by that bus stop. Offer them a ride." Arthur glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable, but he simply nodded and expertly maneuvered the long car toward the curb. Elena Rossi felt the cold seep into her bones. Her nurse's uniform was damp under her coat, and Lily was shivering against her. The bus was 20 minutes late, and the fine mist had turned into a torrential downpour. She hugged her daughter tighter, whispering assurances that they would be home and warm soon, though her own hope was dwindling with the daylight. A long, black car, the kind she only ever saw in movies, glided to a stop beside them. The window hummed down, revealing an older man in a driver's uniform. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice polite and respectful. "My employer would like to offer you and your daughter a ride out of this weather." Elena's first instinct was to refuse. She was wary of strangers, especially those who traveled in such opulent vehicles. It felt like stepping into another world, one where she did not belong and could not navigate. But then Lily sneezed, a small, wet sound that pierced Elena's heart. She looked from the warm, dry interior of the car to her daughter's pale face. Her child's well-being trumped her own apprehension. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We would be very grateful." Arthur got out and opened the door for them, a gesture of old-world courtesy that felt both comforting and alien. As Elena slid onto the plush leather seat, pulling Lily in after her, she saw the car's other occupant for the first time. He sat in the opposite corner, a silhouette in a perfectly tailored suit. The dim interior lights caught the silver of his watch and the sharp line of his jaw. He looked powerful and tired, his eyes holding a deep, unreadable weariness. "Thank you," Elena said again, pulling a tissue from her purse to gently dry Lily's face. You didn't have to do this. The man simply inclined his head, his gaze flickering from her to Lily and back again. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the soft hum of the engine. Lily, however, had never been one for silence. Her wide, curious eyes took in the polished wood grain, the small, glowing screens, and the imposing man in the corner. She was not intimidated, only fascinated. She wriggled on the seat, her damp sneakers leaving a small smudge on the pristine floor mat. Elena quietly reached over to wipe it away, embarrassed. Just then, the man's phone buzzed, a low, insistent sound. He answered it, his voice changing, becoming sharp and decisive. Marcus, what is it? He listened for a moment, his expression hardening. I don't care what the precedent is. Find another way. A clean way. No, I said no. We are not gutting their retirement to make our quarterly report look better. Handle it. He ended the call, the abruptness of it hanging in the air. He ran a hand over his face, looking older than he had a moment before. He seemed to have forgotten they were there. He had made a choice, a difficult one, and Elena had been an accidental witness. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the brief war between profit and principle. Principle had won, but it had clearly cost him something. He finally seemed to notice her again, his gaze meeting hers. For a second, she thought he might apologize or explain, but he said nothing. He had seen her watching him, had seen the quiet understanding in her expression. He was used to people who agreed with him out of fear or ambition. He was not used to the silent, unwavering approval of a stranger in a damp coat. It was Lily who finally shattered the tension. She had been studying the man with the intense scrutiny only a child possesses. She pointed a small finger at him. You look sad, she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Elena's breath hitched. Lily, that's not polite, but the man didn't seem offended. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps amusement, crossed his features. He looked at the little girl. Do I? He asked, his voice softer now. Lily nodded solemnly. My mommy gets sad sometimes, too. Since my daddy went to heaven, Elena's heart constricted. She put a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder, but her daughter was focused entirely on the man. You don't have anyone, Lily continued, her logic simple and devastatingly direct. Your car is too big and too quiet. Julian found himself speechless. The child's words were a perfect, brutal summary of his entire existence. He had a board of directors, hundreds of employees, a network of powerful acquaintances, but he did not have anyone. His car, his office, his penthouse, they were all too big and too quiet. Before he could formulate a response, Lily delivered the final, astonishing blow. She looked from her mother to him, her expression serious, as if brokering the most important deal of her life. You need a wife, she declared. And I need a dad. My mommy is a very good cooker. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena's face flushed with a mixture of horror and mortification. Lily, we do not say things like that, she whispered, her voice strained. I am so sorry, she said, looking at Julian, her eyes pleading for him to understand. She's only 6. She doesn't. But Julian was not angry. He was stunned into a strange, unfamiliar state of grace. He looked at the earnest little girl and the mortified woman beside her. For the first time in years, he felt a crack in the icy wall around his heart. A genuine, unforced smile touched his lips. It felt foreign, like using a muscle he had long forgotten. He dropped them at their modest apartment building, a brick structure that looked warm and lived in despite the dreary weather. As Elena and Lily got out, he spoke. My name is Julian Vance. Elena paused, her hand on the door. Elena Rossi. And this is Lily. Thank you again, Mr. Vance. For everything. He watched them hurry inside, a small, self-contained unit of love and resilience. As the limo pulled away, Lily's words echoed in the vast, quiet space. You need a wife, and I need a dad. It was the most absurd, most audacious, most hopeful thing he had heard in a decade, and it refused to leave him. The next morning, Julian did something he knew was a violation of privacy, a move from his old playbook. He had his assistant, a discreet and efficient woman named Carol, look into Elena Rossi. The guilt was a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by an intense, inexplicable need to know more. The report was on his desk within an hour. It was simple and sad. Elena Rossi was a pediatric nurse at City General Hospital. Her husband, Daniel Rossi, had been a firefighter. He had died 2 years ago, killed in a warehouse blaze while rescuing 3 trapped workers. He was a hero. Elena had been a widow ever since, raising their daughter on a nurse's salary. There were no debts, no scandals, no complications. There was only decency and loss. The mention of the fire sent a jolt through Julian. He instinctively glanced down at his right hand, at the faint, silvery scar that snaked across his knuckles. He usually wore his watch slightly loose to cover it, a subconscious habit. A fire. He knew about fires. He knew the smell of smoke and the heat that stole the air from your lungs. He knew the permanence of the scars they left behind, both inside and out. This new knowledge shifted his perspective. His encounter with Elena and Lily was no longer just a strange, memorable moment. It felt like a point of intersection, a convergence of 2 lives marked by similar tragedies. He felt a pull, a need to see them again, but not as a wealthy benefactor swooping in. He wanted to see them on their own terms, in their own world. He found his pretext in a dusty file regarding his company's philanthropic obligations. The Vance Corporation had a long-standing, if neglected, partnership with City General. He arranged a visit, ostensibly to tour the facilities and discuss a new donation. He told himself it was about corporate responsibility. He knew it was a lie. Walking through the hospital corridors was a disorienting experience. The air smelled of antiseptic and quiet suffering, a stark contrast to the sterile perfume of money and power that filled his own world. In the pediatric wing, the scent was tempered by something else, a stubborn, resilient hope. Walls were painted with cheerful cartoon animals, and the sound of children's laughter occasionally drifted from the rooms. He saw her before she saw him. She was in a room with a small boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. The boy was crying, frightened of the 4 drip in his small arm. Elena was not talking to him in a placating, adult-to-child voice. She was on her knees, at his eye level, her expression full of a calm, genuine empathy. She was explaining how the 4 was a superhero potion, giving his body the power to fight the bad guy germs. She even made a little swooshing sound as she adjusted the bag. The boy's sobs subsided into sniffles, his fear replaced by a flicker of awe. He touched her hand. "Are you a superhero too?" he asked. Elena smiled, a gentle, radiant expression. "We all are," she said softly. "We just have to be brave." Julian stood in the doorway, unseen, feeling like an intruder. He was witnessing an act of pure, unrewarded kindness. There were no cameras, no audience, no personal gain. It was just who she was. The sight of it made him acutely aware of his own transactional existence, where every gesture had a motive and every relationship was a negotiation. He backed away before she could spot him, his heart pounding. He finished his tour with the hospital administrator in a daze, writing a check for a sum that made the man's eyes widen, but Julian barely registered it. His mind was full of the image of Elena on her knees, comforting a sick child. He could not stay away. A few days later, he drove himself to her neighborhood, parking his far too conspicuous car a block away. He walked to a small park near her apartment building, a patch of green with a well-worn playground. He saw Lily on the swings, her mother pushing her from behind. Lily's laughter peeled through the crisp afternoon air. He watched them for a long time, feeling a profound ache of longing. He saw the easy affection between them, the shared smiles, the gentle way Elena brushed a stray hair from her daughter's face. This was what his life lacked. Not just a family, but this simple, unvarnished connection. Finally, he gathered his courage and approached them. "Elena," he said, his voice feeling rusty. She turned, surprise registering on her face, followed by a flicker of caution. Lily, however, beamed. "Sad man," she yelled, jumping off the swing and running toward him. "You found us." Elena rushed after her, a blush rising on her cheeks. "Lily, his name is Mr. Vance. It's Julian," he corrected gently, crouching down to Lily's level. "And I'm not so sad today." Lily studied his face. "It's because you came to the park," she concluded wisely. That day was the first of many. He started meeting them at the park, at first under the guise of being in the neighborhood for business. Soon, the pretense fell away. He was there for them. He learned that Lily loved strawberry ice cream, and believed squirrels had secret meetings to plan their nut-gathering strategies. He learned that Elena had a quiet, sharp sense of humor and a deep love for old black-and-white movies. One afternoon, Lily was showing him a small birdhouse she had made at school. It was crooked and slathered in too much glue, but she was immensely proud of it. As she handed it to him, she noticed the scar on his hand for the first time. She traced it with her tiny finger, her touch surprisingly gentle. "What's this?" she asked, her voice soft with curiosity. Julian's body tensed. He never spoke of the scar, never acknowledged it. It was a relic of a night he had spent 2 decades trying to forget, the night of the fire that had taken his younger brother. He looked at Elena, expecting to see pity or discomfort in her eyes. Instead, he saw only quiet patience. She knew loss. She would understand. He took a breath. "It's from a long time ago," he told Lily. "From a fire. I was trying to help someone." Lily looked from the scar to his face. She did not ask for details. She did not recoil. She simply leaned in and kissed the scar, her small lips warm against his skin. "It's a hero mark," she whispered. "Like my daddy had." In that moment, Julian's carefully constructed defenses shattered. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees washed over him. This little girl, with her innocent, absolute acceptance, had healed a part of him he thought was long dead. He looked at Elena over Lily's head, his eyes shining with unshed tears. She gave him a small, understanding smile that said everything. Their friendship deepened through a series of small, quiet moments. He was invited to their apartment for dinner. He arrived with an obscenely expensive bottle of wine, feeling awkward and out of place. Elena thanked him and put it away for a special occasion, serving him lemonade with the simple spaghetti she had made. The meal, eaten at a small, slightly wobbly kitchen table, was the best he'd had in years. He helped Lily with her homework. He, a man who navigated billion-dollar mergers, found himself completely stumped by second-grade math. The 3 of them ended up laughing until they cried over a particularly tricky word problem. In that small apartment, filled with the smell of marinara sauce and the sound of Lily's laughter, Julian felt a sense of peace he had never known in his penthouse. One evening, he arrived to find Elena looking pale and worried. Lily had a high fever and was listless on the sofa. Elena, the capable nurse who cared for dozens of sick children, was just a frightened mother. Julian found himself stepping into a new role. He went out for medicine, made them both a simple soup, and read stories to Lily until she drifted off into a restless sleep. He stayed late into the night, sitting with Elena in the quiet living room as they watched over the sleeping child. "You're a good man, Julian," she said softly, her voice thick with exhaustion and gratitude. "Thank you." He just shook his head, unable to articulate that it was he who was grateful. They were giving him something he thought he could never have, a place to belong. The crisis, when it came, was swift and brutal. Julian walked into his office one Monday morning to find 2 members of the board and the company's chief legal counsel waiting for him. Their faces were grim. The air was thick with accusation. "We have a problem, Julian," one of the board members, a man named Henderson, said without preamble. He slid a folder across the polished desk. It was a file from their main competitor, containing proprietary data, schematics for a new technology that Vance Corporation was also developing. And attached to it was a chain of emails, seemingly from Julian's own encrypted account, proving he had solicited the information. It was corporate espionage, a clean, simple, and utterly damning frame-up. Julian knew instantly who was behind it. Marcus, his ambitious, resentful subordinate, whom he had recently passed over for a promotion. The man he had chastised in the limo that first day he met Elena. He had chosen integrity over ruthlessness, and now Marcus was making him pay the price. The board did not care about his innocence. The scandal would be catastrophic. Their stock was already tumbling in pre-market trading based on rumors alone. They presented him with a choice, a devil's bargain. "There's a way to contain this," the lawyer explained, his voice smooth and cold. "We shift the blame to the R&D subsidiary we closed last year. The server logs are gone. The key personnel have moved on. We can make it stick. It will be messy for them, but it will save the parent company." Julian felt a chill run down his spine. The subsidiary, the one whose pension fund he had refused to rate. Blaming them would not only be a lie, it would be the ultimate betrayal. It would ruin the reputations of good people and likely jeopardized the very pensions he had fought to protect. It was the old Julian's move. Sacrifice the pawns to save the king. You have until the market opens to decide, Henderson said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Protect yourself, Julian. Protect the company, or we will all go down. They left him alone in the silent office, the damning folders sitting on his desk like a coiled snake. He stared out the window at the city, but he did not see it. He saw Elena's face, her expression of quiet approval when he'd made the right choice in the car. He heard Lily's voice calling his scar a hero mark. Over the past few months, they had shown him a different way to be, a different measure of a man's worth. Was he going to throw that all away to save his fortune and a title? His hands were shaking. The pressure was suffocating, pulling him back toward the man he used to be. The choice seemed impossible. His entire life's work on one side, and a newfound, fragile sense of self on the other. He felt utterly lost, adrift in a storm of his own making. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys and left. He did not go to his lawyers or his crisis managers. He drove himself, breaking a dozen traffic laws, to the one place that felt like a sanctuary. He parked outside Elena's building, his heart hammering against his ribs. He did not know what he would say, what he was even asking for. He just knew he could not face this alone. He stood outside her door for a full minute before he could bring himself to knock. When she opened it, her smile of welcome faltered as she saw his face. He looked broken, hunted. He had not shaved, his expensive suit was rumpled, and his eyes were wild with desperation. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not press him for details. She simply stepped aside, her expression softening with a deep, immediate concern. "Come in, Julian," she said, her voice a calm anchor in his chaotic sea. He stepped inside, and the warmth and simple order of her home enveloped him. Lily was at the kitchen table, coloring, and she looked up and gave him a bright, uncomplicated smile. The contrast between this peaceful domestic scene and the corporate carnage he had just fled was so stark it made him dizzy. Elena led him to the sofa and went to the kitchen. She returned a few minutes later with a steaming mug of tea, pressing it into his trembling hands. "Drink this," she said gently. He obeyed, the warmth seeping into his chilled fingers. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the scratch of Lily's crayon on paper and the ticking of a clock on the wall. He did not have to tell her the whole story. He gave her the broad strokes. A betrayal, a false accusation, an impossible choice that would either ruin him or destroy innocent people. He confessed that every instinct he had honed over 20 years in business was screaming at him to take the selfish way out, to protect himself at any cost. "I don't know who I am anymore," he finally whispered, the confession raw and painful. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, and now I'm thinking of letting it all burn." Elena listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving his face. When he finished, she did not offer solutions or platitudes. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his on the warm mug. Her touch was steady and sure. "They can take your company, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They can take your money and your title, but they can't take who you are. They can't take your spine. You get to decide who that man is, not them." Her words were simple, but they cut through his panic and confusion. She was not telling him what to do. She was reminding him of who he had become. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her strength, her unwavering moral clarity, her faith in him. It was a gift more valuable than anything he owned. In that moment, the choice became clear. It was not a choice between his old life and his new values. It was a choice between being a king in an empty castle and being a man worthy of the trust in her eyes. He knew what he had to do. Julian called the press conference for 8:30 the next morning, 30 minutes before the opening bell. The room was a feeding frenzy of reporters and television cameras, all of them sensing blood in the water. The members of his board sat in the front row, their faces like stone masks. They assumed he had come to his senses, that he was about to perform the necessary surgery to save the company. He walked to the podium, feeling strangely calm. He looked out at the sea of faces, but he pictured only two, Elena and Lily. He had spoken to Elena just before he left, his voice steady. "Thank you," was all he had said. "For everything, be brave," she had replied softly. He began to speak, his voice clear and resonant in the hushed room. He did not read from the statement his legal team had prepared. He spoke from the heart. He laid out the entire situation, not as a corporate problem, but as a moral one. He detailed Marcus's betrayal and the false evidence planted against him. Then, he did the unthinkable. "The board has offered me a way out," he said, his gaze sweeping over Henderson and the others. "A scapegoat. A convenient fiction that would preserve the company's stock price and my own position. For most of my career, I would have taken that deal. It is, after all, good business." A murmur went through the crowd. He held up a hand for silence. But good business and good ethics are not always the same thing. And I have learned, rather late in life, which one matters more. He took a deep breath, preparing for the final, irreversible step. "I will not participate in this lie," he declared. "The men and women of the subsidiary we closed are innocent, and they will not be sacrificed to protect my reputation." He then went further, confessing his own past failings, the times he had prioritized profit over people. He spoke of a culture he had helped create, one that had allowed a man like Marcus to flourish. And then, he made it personal. He unfastened his watch and held up his right hand, showing the cameras the silvery scar. 20 years ago, I lost my brother in a fire," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "A fire in a building whose owner had cut corners on safety to save money. I carry this scar to remind me of the human cost of that kind of greed. I have not always honored that memory. But I will start today." He announced his immediate resignation as Chief Executive Officer of Vance Corporation. He also pledged his entire personal fortune, every last share and asset, to create a trust. That trust would not only guarantee the pensions of the subsidiary employees, but would compensate any party harmed by his company's past ethical lapses. He was leaving himself with nothing. He was choosing integrity over his empire. He finished his speech, turned away from the podium without taking questions, and walked out of the room, leaving stunned silence and the frantic flashing of cameras in his wake. He did not go back to his penthouse. He went to Elena's apartment. She opened the door before he even knocked, as if she had been waiting. He walked in, feeling like a man who had just stepped off a cliff, unsure if he would fly or fall. She did not say a word. She just opened her arms, and he collapsed into her embrace, the tension and fear of the last 48 hours finally breaking. He held on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved around him. They watched the aftermath on the small television in her living room, sitting together on the sofa with Lily nestled between them. The financial news channels were in a state of shock. Pundits debated his sanity, his motives. But then, a different story began to emerge. News crews had found some of the former subsidiary employees. A tearful older woman, a former factory line worker, called him a hero. A retired engineer spoke of Julian's father, who had founded the company on a handshake and a promise to always take care of his people. The public sentiment turned like a great tide. Social media exploded with support for his act of corporate suicide. He was not seen as a fool, but as a man of incredible courage. By midday, federal investigators had raided Marcus's office, acting on a tip from Julian's legal team, who had, in the end, chosen to back their client's confession. The rival company, implicated in the conspiracy, saw its stock go into freefall. The board of Vance Corporation was facing a shareholder revolt. Julian watched it all unfold, feeling a sense of detachment. He had expected ruin and scorn. He had not expected vindication. The world he had left behind was in chaos, but in this small, warm living room, there was only peace. Lily, who had been listening intently, seemed to grasp the essence of the situation. She patted his arm. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have that sad office anymore. You can come to the park with us every day now." He looked from Lily's trusting face to Elena's proud, tear-filled eyes. He had lost a kingdom, but he had gained a world. The victory was not in the news reports or the public praise. It was here, in this room, with them. It was a shared victory, a quiet, profound realization that he had made the right choice, and he had not ended up alone. A year passed. The world moved on, as it always does. The Vance Corporation, under new leadership, survived, chastened, and restructured. Marcus was convicted. But for Julian, that was all distant noise. His life had been rebuilt from the ground up, on a new and far more solid foundation. He had been true to his word. His fortune was gone, funneled into the trust he had created. He sold the penthouse, the art collection, the fleet of cars. He kept only enough to buy a modest, comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, not far from Elena's apartment. It had a small yard, a slightly crooked fence, and rooms filled with sunlight. He did not return to the corporate world. Instead, he poured his energy and his considerable expertise into a new project. With the public goodwill he had earned and a few key investors who believed in his new vision, he established the Daniel Rossi Foundation. Its first and primary mission was the construction of a new, state-of-the-art pediatric burn unit at City General Hospital, named in honor of Elena's late husband. Today was the dedication ceremony. Julian stood not in a designer's suit, but in a simple blazer and slacks, looking out at the crowd. He felt a nervous energy he hadn't experienced since his very first business presentation decades ago. This felt infinitely more important. He saw Elena in the front row, holding Lily's hand. She gave him a smile that calmed his racing heart. When he was called to the podium, he did not speak for long. He talked about heroes. He talked about firefighters like Daniel Rossi, who ran into danger to save others. He talked about nurses like Elena, who fought quiet battles with compassion and skill every single day. And he talked about children like Lily, whose honesty and love could heal the most wounded of hearts. I used to think wealth was measured in stock prices and assets, he concluded, his voice thick with emotion as he looked directly at Elena. But I was wrong. True wealth is found in integrity, in purpose, and in the love of a family you choose. This place is a testament to that truth. Later that evening, the celebration was over. The three of them were home. The new house was quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of people who belonged together. Lily, exhausted from the day's excitement, had fallen asleep on the living room rug, a half-finished drawing of the new hospital wing beside her. Julian carried her upstairs to her bed, tucking her in with a gentleness that now felt completely natural. He found Elena on the back porch, looking up at the stars, which were more visible here than they had ever been from his penthouse. He stood beside her, their shoulders lightly touching. The air was cool and smelled of freshly cut grass. "It was a beautiful day," she said softly. "Daniel would have been so proud." "I hope so," Julian replied. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "Elena," he began, his voice hesitant. "We've built a hospital wing together. We've built this home. I want to build this life with you officially. I want to ask you to marry me." She turned to him, her eyes shimmering in the dim light from the house. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "Julian," she whispered, her voice full of love and gentle amusement. "We've been building it every day for a year. My answer has always been yes." Just then, a small, sleepy voice came from the doorway. "Are you getting married now?" Lily stood there, rubbing her eyes, her favorite teddy bear clutched in one hand. Julian and Elena looked at each other and then back at her, their hearts full. "Yes, sweetie," Elena said. "We are." Lily padded over to them. She didn't go to her mother. She went to Julian and wrapped her small arms around his legs, hugging him tightly. She looked up at him, her expression serious and content. "Good," she said simply. "Now it's for real. Good night, Dad." She turned and padded back to bed, leaving a stunned and profound silence in her wake. "Dad." It wasn't a proposal this time. It wasn't a wish. It was a fact. It was her reality. Julian felt a single tear trace a path down his cheek. He looked at Elena, his expression full of a joy so immense he had no words for it. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. Then he looked down at his own right hand, at the scar that was no longer a mark of loss, but a reminder of his journey. A hero mark. Elena saw where he was looking and covered his hand with her free one, her warmth encompassing his. They stood together on the porch of their home, under a vast and hopeful sky, a family forged not by blood, but by a choice to be brave, to be kind, and to begin again.